So what have we here? You probably know what this is, right? This is a floating switch that we typically use for pumping machine, so that when your water level is low to a certain extent, the machine can get turned on, and when it's almost full, it gets turned off so you don't start pumping water away. But there is a problem here. If you have ever used this before, you'd realize you probably don't get to use this guy for more than maybe 2 weeks, 2 months if you are lucky, because the internal switch designed for this guy is not usually capable of carrying the load of the pumping machine. And also the way it's typically wired is such that the 220 volt AC actually runs through this cable into this switch, whereas this switch is dropped into my water. The water I'm probably going to use to bath or to wash my hand under the basin. Frankly, I don't feel too comfortable having a 220 volt AC running into my tank, especially when I'm using it inside the house. So these two problems are what we want to address with this little guy. And this is actually a controller for a pumping machine. But what it does is, instead of having to run the 220 volts straight into this guy, this little guy sends just a minimal 12 volt DC into the floating switch, and also ensure that the whole load of the pumping machine does not actually sit directly on the floating switch, giving your floating switch a very long lifespan. Because usually when you are starting a pumping machine, there is what we call a starting current, which is usually very huge, and the kind of switch you will find inside this floating switch is such that it cannot just carry that. So by the time you switch on it switches on your pumping machine 2, 3, maybe 10 times if you are lucky, that switch is going to start melting internally, and once it starts melting, this guy is gone and you're going to go get another one. So instead of having this guy carrying the whole load, we've designed this guy to actually carry the burden. And trust me, this guy is probably never going to get damaged, because the kind of switch you have in here is much more than enough to carry whatever kind of pumping machine you're using. And as well as doing that, this guy isolates your tank entirely from the 220 volt AC, because God forbid if for whatever reason this guy were to leak, and trust me, I've seen it happen before. If this guy leaks, the implication is the 220 volt AC get contact with the water you have in the tank, and while you are trying to bath or wash your hand or something, you can get shocked and electrocuted by that. But by making sure we don't send such a level voltage into the tank, we can actually keep you safe even if this guy leaks. So again, this is the controller. I've connected it to its supply. There's a 220 volt coming in here. Don't mind this short wire that is being used. It's actually supposed to be something much more thicker in installation, but because we are just on the bench testing here, we've used a tiny wire to bring in the power. Now if you look at the output that goes to the pumping machine here, so we have a much thicker cable in here, and the pumping machine connects here, while the floating switch itself is going to connect right here. So I'm just going to power it on, and that is it. So the red indicator there tells you the device is powered on, but there is nothing coming out of here yet. This is where the pumping machine gets connected, unless the floating switch instructs it to turn on. So I'm going to connect the floating switch in here right now. Okay, so we have the floating switch connected now, and now when this guy is installed, if you have enough water in the tank, the floating switch is supposed to be elevated just like this. But once the water level is going down gradually, the floating switch descends until it gets to a point where this happens. And you see, at that point, this guy is triggered on, and by then it's powering the pumping machine that would have been connected right here. But the floating switch itself is basic and that simple. The beauty of this guy is just that it protects you from having direct contact with 220 volt that would rather have been wired into the tank through this floating switch. and as well as that, it also doesn't put the whole pumping machine load on the floating switch, so that this guy carries the whole load, and it is actually equipped with a switch huge enough to actually carry it. So let's tear this guy down and see what we actually have inside. I'm just gonna open the cap. Okay, so this is what we have inside, equipped with a breaker that takes the supply in, and the output of course comes through the breaker through a switch we have in here. So this is the relay switch that carries the whole load of the machine, and we have an inbuilt power pack. This is the power supply. So this little guy here is actually the one supplying 12 volts. So we wire that 12 volts over to the floating switch, so you don't get to have 220 in your tank like I said, and the pumping machine is finally connected in here. So if you don't want to run out of water in your tank again, contact us and get a water level controller for your pumping machine.